Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. My name is Kim Dinkins. I'm Save the Manatee Club's Senior Conservation Associate. I live here in Ocala, Florida, which is kind of in the middle of the state and is Springs country. So I've been working in this field for about 20 years on water quality, restoration projects, and water quantity, water supply planning type issues. Again, we really appreciate you being here, and tonight we're going to talk a little bit about Florida's unique geology that creates our aquifer and our springs, and why springs are so important for manatees. We'll also talk about some threats to springs and what's being done to protect them. So we all know and love manatees, but I wanted to just start out with some facts. They can be very large. They average 10 feet long and can be up to 1,000 pounds or more. They breathe, obviously, air, and they typically breathe every 3 to 5 minutes, but while they're resting, they can hold their breath for up to 20 minutes. They give live birth and they care for their young for about 2 years. They can eat salt and freshwater vegetation. They prefer submerged aquatic vegetation, but they're pretty indiscriminate. They eat floating vegetation too. They've been known to hoist themselves up on banks a little bit to reach upland plants. They're warm-blooded. They can't live in temperatures less than 68 degrees for long periods of time, which is why springs are so important for them. Springs flow at a constant 72 degrees regardless of outside temperatures or where they're found in the state. Manatees can eat up to 10% of their body weight each day, but more likely eat about 7%. Not all of them are 100 or 1,000 pounds, so they're not all eating 100 pounds a day, but that's kind of the typical range that they'll eat. They're the only entirely herbivorous marine mammal in the northern and central states, continents, America, and they eat all types of submerged aquatic vegetation. They've co-evolved with these systems, so they kind of act like a lawnmower and promote regrowth of vegetation. In areas, if they do get hungry though, they will dig up roots sometimes. So in areas where there's not a lot of vegetation, this tends to happen more often, meaning that once we lose seagrasses in certain areas, manatees could contribute to it being more difficult for those areas to regenerate. They have marching molars, meaning that they can lose their teeth and they're replaced with additional teeth. So manatees are not fat, they are big boned. They have very little body fat, which is why they have trouble in cold waters. Their bones are very dense and their lungs take up about a third of the length of their bodies. Oftentimes when a manatee is killed by a boat strike, it's because their lungs are punctured by split rib bones rather than from the wounds that the propeller causes, although those can be deadly also. Manatees don't have any natural predators and they're adored for their peaceful presence. They face a lot of threats though. We talked about boat strikes, which are shown in the photos on the left, and at the let's go this here. Sorry, I missed one. On the left and at the top of this slide, in some areas they're starving to death and they can become entangled in fishing line and other debris, which sometimes causes death by ingestion. And they can die of cold stress, as shown as this in this photograph on the right. This causes their metabolism to slow down, which leads to digestion problems and weight loss. It also weakens their immune systems, making them vulnerable to toxins and other diseases. Manatees face a different but similar scenario to other threatened and endangered species. Their habitat has been altered. In Florida, not only have we altered the way that water flows and changed manatees' access to springs, often restricting it entirely because of dams or making canals out of rivers, we've also provided an artificial habitat for them at about 10 power plants around the state. So they've come to rely on those over time. And as these power plants age and go offline, it's becoming increasingly important to find alternate places for them to go. That will likely mean that we have to reestablish the connections with springs, as well as making sure that they're safe when they go to those springs once those reconnections are established. So during the summertime, manatees can be found in almost any type of water body in Florida, from springs to coastal areas to canals and even ditches. Their population is well distributed on the east and west coast of Florida, and recent estimates as of 2018 indicate that we have about 8,800 animals, so about 4,400 on each coast. Of course, that doesn't account for the 1,600 that have died during this recent mortality event. But the photo on this at the top here and the adoption certificate that you see is of a manatee Isla. who was rescued in New Jersey. And you may have also heard about Chessie, who was rescued not one time, but twice, and has been seen as far north as Massachusetts. So they do have a pretty wide summer range going up north and then over to off sometimes as far west as Texas. But in the wintertime, you'll see them in Florida and in other southern areas. So this slide shows you a number of our warm water sites. They migrate to these warmer waters and a bit further south. The map shows the primary wintering areas for manatees. You can see those power plants in the green triangles, areas known as thermal basins in red squares, and our springs in those black dots. You'll see Crystal River on the west coast and Blue Spring on the east coast are major manatee areas with year-round populations, but really big winter populations. So currently about 60% of manatees rely on power plants in the oldest times of the year. Springs provide a more consistent and reliable source of water though. So we know that about 20% of manatees on the west coast go to Crystal River and upwards of 15% head to Blue Spring. We had some record numbers there this past winter, so that was an interesting change. A major challenge in addition to needing to restore access to springs is that manatees have a strong site fidelity, meaning that they return to the same place year after year, and mothers show their calves where to go. So when access to a certain area is prohibited or they have to find a new place, it takes a while for that to occur. Let's talk about springs and why we have them. In Florida, our water comes from an underground aquifer, which is a body of permeable rock that can contain or transmit groundwater. This is because of our karst topography. We have about 92% of our population relying on the Floridan aquifer for its drinking water. Our karst topography is characterized by soluble rocks. This is typically limestone, dolomite, and gypsum. In some areas of Florida, the aquifer is overlain by a confining layer, which is typically clays and heavy soils that don't allow water to move freely between the layers. So those will often create a superficial aquifer. The Floridan aquifer system is about 100,000 square miles and covers Florida as well as portions of Georgia, Alabama, and South Carolina. In some areas, it's close to the surface and very porous, like in that photo that I showed you on the last slide of Peacock Springs here. So you can see this kind of Swiss cheese situation going on in this karst topography. We have the majority of Florida, again, relies on that Floridan aquifer for water, but we have other areas in Florida where they rely on an intermediate aquifer, such as on the west coast, Lee and Charlotte counties, and then in the Panhandle and then the Biscayne area, they rely on superficial aquifers. This slide shows a cross-section of the aquifer, showing the superficial sands, areas of that confining layer, and then the limestone below, which again is more like a Swiss cheese than those blocks that are shown. In those areas where there's no confining layer or there's a shallow confining layer, we get springs because that water is under pressure. So it bubbles up in those areas where there are voids. What this doesn't show is other characteristics of the karst aquifer, like karst windows, such as Devil's Den or Blue Grotto. There's a type of formation called polges, such as Payne's Prairie. These are like obviously prairie systems that are characterized by a lot of little sinkholes and then oftentimes larger sinkholes. And then we don't talk about sinkholes here, but those are areas where there are voids that occur, but there's no water to fill them. This is kind of that demonstration of the spring where there's a sand layer and maybe a confining layer, but it would be very thin. And what you can see here is how susceptible springs can be to what's going on the land surface. So there's not a lot of any sort of nutrient uptake that happens in that sand, although different soils perform differently. Springs are very susceptible, and groundwater underneath those springs are very susceptible to contamination. So in Florida, we have over 1,000 springs, and most of those are located in the central portion of the state, and that area where the aquifer is fairly close to the surface. We categorize springs based on the amount of daily flow, and the ones in the map on the right are our first magnitude springs. These have a daily flow of 65 million gallons or more, and there are 33 of those in Florida. Some of those are significantly larger than others, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. The three first magnitude springs that are very important for manatees are Itchnatucknee near Fort White in North Florida, Crystal River in West Florida, and then Blue Spring in Volusia County. So smaller springs are considered, we talked about the first magnitude springs. Those smaller springs are considered second magnitude if they're less than 65 million gallons a day, but greater than 6.5 million. And third magnitude if they're less than 6.5 million gallons a day. So many of our first magnitude springs are in public ownership by the state, but lots of the second and third magnitude springs are in private ownership, and they're managed by regular citizens on their own property. Some of these are open to the public as attractions, and others are secret hideaways for the owners, which is pretty special. Just wanted to kind of give you an overview of a few of our first magnitude springs in Florida. These were our first tourist attractions, and both of these are in Marion County. So Silver Springs is a historic attraction, and it flows at about 530 million gallons of water per day. That's down from 580 million gallons just a few decades ago, so we've seen significant flow loss there. And in Rainbow, it's about 482 million gallons a day. So this is about 1 billion gallons a day in 2 large springs, which is about the same amount of water that's used in New York City each day. It exceeds the daily use of most of the cities in Florida, like Miami and those larger cities like Miami and Jacksonville. So springs are very important to the flora and fauna and people in Florida, and so we have a couple of ways that we protect them. Those are through total maximum daily loads, which describes how much of a nutrient can enter into the system while still allowing it to function, hosting recreation, fish, and other aquatic life. And the other is minimum flows and levels, which describes how much water can be withdrawn from a system and still allow it to provide adequate environmental benefit. These programs apply to water bodies statewide, including rivers, lakes, and wetlands. But in 2016, Florida passed the Florida Springs and Aquifer Protection Act, which identified 30 outstanding springs that deserve expedited study and protections beyond what's typically offered by just the total maximum daily load and MFL programs. Here's a picture of those 30 outstanding Florida springs. You'll note that each of the 3 manatee areas I mentioned before are listed here: Anatomy, Crystal River, Kings Bay, and Volusia Blue. Crystal River, Kings Bay, and Volusia Blue. We'll talk more about some of these specific springs as we discuss some of the challenges and threats to our springs and how those impact manatees. And like I said, most of these are in public ownership, and they're oftentimes open to the public for swimming or other types of recreation. So threats to springs or threats to manatees. We know that they provide essential warm water habitat, and some not so great things are happening to them. Flows have declined. We're seeing a loss of manatee forage in the way of submerged aquatic vegetation due to nutrient pollution. We've cut off access, which prohibits not just manatees, but migratory fish and affects water qualities. And we're seeing degradation of springs and additional manatee harassment due to use by humans who just aren't aware of how these systems function. So minimum flows and levels are designed to protect springs, but in some areas it's a little too late. We're seeing declining spring flow in about 30% of our springs. They have documented reduced flow. Some of this can be attributed to changes in rainfall over the past 20 years, but most of it or some of it is definitely due to pumping. In fact, of the 30 outstanding Florida springs, 25% have either prevention or recovery plans associated with them. And for 2 springs that have benefits for manatees, the Volusia Blue and Homosassa, which is a bit smaller, we've seen a noticeable decline, even though those are reported as meeting their minimum flow and level. These changes have the potential to reduce habitat and affect water quality. So we're also seeing water quality declines in springs. 25 of the 30 outstanding Florida springs are impaired for nitrogen and phosphorus. For reference, the target nitrate concentration for springs is 0.35 milligrams per liter. And you can see on that right-hand map that throughout the Central Florida area, which is springs country, groundwater nitrate concentrations is much higher than that 0.35. In some areas, it's even greater than 1. This, combined with reduced flow, has caused changes to springs ecosystems that are difficult to ignore. So changes in those nutrients and ambient water quality, such as dissolved oxygen, favor algal-dominated systems rather than those submerged aquatic vegetation systems that are so important for manatees. We have some amazing photographers and artists in Florida who are documenting these changes to bring attention to this issue. So on the left is a photo of Anatomy Springs over 17 years, the then and the now, and then Devil's Ear in just 18 months. It's not uncommon to see eelgrass die-off during certain times of the winter, but the water quality changes create these good conditions for the systems to be dominated by algae, and it's difficult to recover those SAV, or submerged aquatic vegetation communities. This is an example of the type of messages that groups are trying to get out to the public to help them make the connection that what we're doing on the ground surface gets into our groundwater. So I touched earlier on how we've blocked access to springs for manatees. There are over 1,000 dams in Florida, which is shown on that map on the left-hand side there. And most of them are over 50 years old. So while not all of them block access to springs, a number of them do, and most of them do limit manatee access to freshwater sites. They can also be a hazard, since there have been incidences of manatees becoming trapped in a dam or a lock structure and dying. One major impoundment that is a significant barrier to manatees is the Kirkpatrick Dam in northeast Marion County and southwest Putnam County. The Kirkpatrick Dam is along the Aquifer River. And the impoundment that is caused by the dam, creates this lake-type system that covers 20 Aquifer River springs that are currently submerged between that artificially high water level, meaning that manatees can't take advantage of their year-round warm temperatures. And although about 100 manatees are able to navigate their way through that lock structure, we know that some of these covered springs could possibly provide habitat for hundreds of manatees or more each. The dam also prevents manatees from access to Silver River, which is a tributary, and that network of springs. It's just one example of a dam that impacts manatee access to springs. Like I mentioned, there's others around the state, including Lake Rousseau on the Withlacoochee River and Tarpon Lake in Southwest Florida. So finally, there are increasing conflicts with manatees and humans at springs. Each year, about 30% of manatee deaths are attributed to boat strikes, and Florida has just surpassed 1 million boater registrations. So while we see an increase in manatee population over time, we're also seeing a disproportionately high number of boat strike deaths. Also, with more people moving and recreating in Florida, it means that more people are using the springs, either because they don't know or they don't care. Manatees are increasingly being harassed by people who want to touch them, feed them, and sometimes harm them. Human use of springs can significantly impact the amount of vegetation in the area, so it gets trampled or pulled up by boats and boat propellers. And then when manatees start to avoid the springs that are available to them, it presents an additional hazard for them. So some of the factors that contribute to this are likely that manatees like to be in the same area that humans are. They come to the surface to breathe air, and they spend time in those shallow grass beds, and then they live close to the shore where there's fresh water and also where people tend to be. But there's some good news for manatees, and I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about that. In Crystal River, we've got a couple things that have happened over the years. We have some good news in Gemini Springs, and then that Great Florida Riverway, the Aquifer River system. There's a good number of good things happening there. So just to kind of take you back to the 1970s, there was a company in Crystal River that wanted to come in, build a hotel and some bridges and other commercial features on islands within the area. And citizens in the state realized that this wasn't a good idea, and Florida's Board of Trustees denied their application to use submerged lands for their bridges. A big no. They got a big no. So through private and public fundraising, those parcels were purchased, and this is the beginning of what is now the Crystal River National Wildlife Refuge, which was established for manatee protections and is the site of some of the first manatee sanctuaries. So fast forward to 2010, another developer wanted to come in and develop an area called Three Sisters Springs. This is an area that was very important for manatee habitat, and it had been entitled for residential development back into the early 90s. But a partnership of local governments, agencies, and non-governmental organizations, including Save the Manatee Club, raised $10.5 million to protect the spring and the spring run. And there have been other acquisitions throughout the state over the years, and in some instances, landowners have decided not to develop their areas or their property because they understand the importance of springs for Florida. Another project in Crystal River, I mentioned a lot of springs are becoming dominated by algae, and you saw the photos of the SAV loss. The same thing was happening in Kings Bay, and in 2014, the Southwest Florida Water Management District initiated a program to restore eelgrass in the area, along with public support from organizations like St. Crystal River, the project has been going on for almost a decade, and the eelgrass restoration is taking off. You can see how happy this manatee is on the right-hand side here. And that is really a big success story for the Kings Bay area. It has a lot of public support and a lot of pride for that community. And then just last year, we started receiving some notifications about manatees using Gemini Springs. And we think that this is because a couple of years ago, in about 2020, the St. Johns River Water Management District conducted a project in DeBerry Bayou to remove years of muck and vegetation that had been choking off access to the spring. I-4 crosses in this area, and alterations for that construction, as well as years of growth, was making it impassable by boaters. So in 2021, again, we got that call that people were seeing manatees in Gemini Springs for the first time, and you can see that manatee on the right-hand side here. And lastly, we are working closely with a coalition of organizations, there are about 60 non-governmental organizations, churches, businesses who are promoting restoration of the Ocklawaha River. And although this year was a little bit disappointing through the legislative session, not a lot happened. We're starting to learn more and more about how much support is out there for this project. It's been a bit of a political boondoggle for the last 45 to 50 years, but recent polls by both the St. Johns River Water Management District and an independent conservative pollster show overwhelming support on the order of 75% of people in favor of restoration. I wanted to point out a few, obviously our website, we have a lot of resources there if you are interested in learning more about manatees, but there are a lot of organizations that have really great information about aquifers and protecting aquifers and what's happening to our springs. And then, so that would be the Blue Water Audit, the Springs Institute, other folks who are doing research, and then of course the freetheocklawahariver.com. So I am available for questions if anybody has any. I see some hands raised, so that's good. Ooh. Cora, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. I went a little faster than I had planned, so I hope that there are some good questions out there.
You're just reminding everyone to please put your questions in the Q&A or the chat function. That way I can address them to Kim and Kim can see them. Also, I know some of you were posting in the chat that you were unable to see the slides. However, some people were able to see the slides. So there was some confusion about that. I apologize for that, but we will be posting the recording on our website. You'll be getting an email with a link to the recording. So if you missed part of the presentation or you were not able to see the slides, you will be able to re-watch that and see that way. So let me see if there's any questions in the, yes, okay. So the first one, how long does it usually take for the sea cows to swim to warmer waters in Florida?
Ooh, that's a good question. I might defer to you, Cora. Do you have an idea?
Well, it really depends where manatees spend the summer months. So like Kim said, they may go all the way up to Georgia or the Carolinas. We see some that go out west to like Alabama, Louisiana, or even as far west as Texas. So usually when the water temperature cools down in those other states, they will start migrating back to Florida. Now, some of them don't make it in time, unfortunately, but most of them will. So they usually, you know, if they're outside of Florida, will start traveling towards Florida in like maybe middle and late October, you know, depending on temperature. And then it just really depends. Some manatees, they just go, they don't stop anywhere. A good example of that is at Blue Spring, sometimes we see manatees that have little barnacles on them, which means they are coming from salt water. So they must have swum all the way down from Jacksonville, maybe in just a couple of days. So it really depends, you know, where they're coming from, how fast they can reach the warm water sources.
And on that note, Cora mentioned that sometimes they don't make it down to warmer water or they struggle, and there is a very active and coordinated effort through the Manatee Rehabilitation and Rescue and Rehabilitation Partnership that sends rescue teams up to those areas to bring manatees down, make sure that they have a fighting chance over winter time.
Yes, absolutely. All right, so the next question, well, I address it to you, Kim, and if you want me to do it, will alligators attack manatees?
No, manatees have no natural predators, and we even have a manatee that you can adopt named Gator, who has apparently made friends with manatees. So oftentimes, in fact, I was just reading an article about an extremely cold event where both manatees and alligators were kind of congregating at a power plant to stay warm. So yeah, and I don't know, Cora, if you have any more to add to that. You've probably seen it in your research.
Yeah, we see it a lot at Blue Spring. We don't really know exactly why that is. It could just be that the manatee is too big and the alligator just doesn't go after it. They usually go after smaller prey and then, let it sit for a while and come back to it. And maybe it just doesn't occur to them that they could do the same thing with a manatee, with another aquatic mammal. It could also be the manatee is just so peaceful that even the alligator doesn't want to bother it. But we don't quite know, but it's very interesting. Even small calves, where they're usually with mom, and at Blue Spring we see them in vicinity of very large gators, and we've never seen an issue. So the only real predator they have is people. So I don't know if I'm taking the questions in the right order. I don't think so. So I'm going to go back to the bottom here. Aside from money donations, what can people from other states do to help?
In terms of springs, and even manatee protection issues, I would just say monitor our website. We oftentimes will have letters that can be written to the Biden administration or whatever administration is in the White House and your legislators to just let them know that manatee protections are important to you, and that there are a lot of them that are just endangered species specific or general endangered species and threatened species issues. So just that would be the best way, I would think. Do we have any, I don't know about other ways, getting involved in your own local community to help just facilitate that overall idea that these systems are important to you is a good way to get involved.
Yeah, we also have an action alert network. So if you're interested, you can sign up at savethemanatee.org/sign-up. I can put that in the chat too. So anytime we need the public's help with like a petition or something, that's something, you can do. We also have an Adopt a Manatee program where you can actually adopt a real living manatee. And we have a bunch of volunteer opportunities as well. So we have volunteers that help us with virtual presentations, for example. So even if you're not located in Florida, you can participate in that as well from another state.
We're also doing a virtual 5K and a couple of other type of awareness activities that you can participate in. You don't have to really show us your Apple Watch or anything to say that you've done it. Not that we wouldn't encourage you to, but definitely a way to do that is through social media and just raising awareness on your social media accounts.
Yes, absolutely. All right, so I'm taking the questions from the Q&A chat box first, and I'm going to jump back to the chat. Some people are asking about the recording. Yes, so the recording will be available. We will be sending that out via email as well as putting it on our website and our social media. So if you missed part of it or you want to rewatch it, that will be posted. Is there a difference in the impact or severity of nutrient pollution on springs versus other Florida waterways?
Well, I would say that the method by which nutrients get into the waterways are different in springs versus other surface water bodies. Although we do know that there are groundwater impacts to a lot of our lakes and streams and things. But in a spring, you have a spring shed, and oftentimes you have just kind of you have the effects of that spring shed coming up into the main spring boil. So you see, I guess, a larger area in a larger impact area in a smaller system. Most of the springs in Florida have a spring run, and you'll see those impacts throughout the spring run. But again, the way that the topography works in Florida, the watershed of a lake or a pond is typically going to be impacted by your surface water runoff more so than your groundwater infiltration. I hope that answers the question.
Well, if it didn't, then the person can clarify if they.
Well, and I will say too, it does, the effects of these nutrients are similar. They increase algal growth, they decrease clarity of water, and so you'll see SAV, or so that's submerged aquatic vegetation in lakes and in springs change. The other thing about springs, sorry, I'm going on and on, but the other thing about springs is that they're impacted by, again, that groundwater. Also, surface water will affect them, but when you have situations where you have lower dissolved oxygen or changes in dissolved oxygen, your fauna will change. So what we think is happening in springs sometimes is that those grazers that are keeping that algae away aren't able to survive for longer periods of times because of those fluctuations. And so we'll end up like snail populations and things like that. We've seen a decrease in those. So the thought is that perhaps the absence of the snails is allowing the algae to proliferate and stopping the SAV from growing back.
I think that was a great answer. So I'm going to, let's see, go to the next question. We have a lot of questions in the chat. I am going to the Q&A section first. I'm going to go to the chat next. If you have a question, please type them either in the Q&A section or this chat. I know some of you are raising their hands. We can't unmute people, so if you please just put them in the chat, we will address them that way. So Allison is asking, how successful was the hand feeding of romaine to the manatees that were starving due to lack of seagrass?
The hand feeding, well, first of all, I want to clarify, it wasn't hand feeding. They actually put the lettuce in PVC type contraptions and sort of sent it into the water body so that the manatees were not being hand fed in order to make it so that they weren't becoming, accustomed to humans feeding them. I think that it's safe to say that that was a pilot scale program with pilot scale results. So while, and it wasn't ever intended to like fatten up the manatees, it was just to get them over the hump. So I think that we would have to defer to Fish and Wildlife Commission to say how successful that was. I can say that they did receive a lot of donations. They were feeding thousands of pounds of manatees, thousands of pounds of romaine a day. And I would say that in general, they felt that it was a successful pilot project.
And it's just adding to that, it's extremely important to remember that this pilot feeding program was only carried out in one part of Florida. It remains illegal for anyone without permission to feed manatees, and it doesn't solve the problem. It was really a small band-aid put on a gaping wound, so to speak. So what we really need to address is these underlying issues, which Kim was talking a lot about: nutrient pollution, anything that gets into the waterways, restoring that and restoring the seagrasses. So this experimental feeding trial was only a short-term solution to try to get the manatees in that one area through the winter, to not have more of them die to starvation. And we've still seen, lots of them dying this winter. So it's worked in a way, but it's definitely not a long-term fix. So maybe just to give Kim a little break, there's a question from Richard. I can probably talk really briefly about, do you coordinate in-person volunteer opportunities? And if so, what kind of activities does that entail? Yes, we have a very extensive volunteer program. So we have volunteers that help us with events, tabling events, presentations, both in person as well as virtual. If you're in the Blue Spring area, we have a Blue Spring Observer, a Manatee Observer program. So you can find more information about it on our website at savethemanatee.org/volunteer. We also partner with other organizations that are doing habitat restoration, seagrass planting, those kind of things. So if you're interested in those things, you can submit that to us as well through our application, and then we can get you in touch with those organizations. Right.
And that's oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to jump over to the chat because I feel there's a lot of questions in the chat and I don't want to ignore those people.
Okay, and I just, to add to that, in-person volunteer opportunities, this kind of this grassroots effort of getting people out into the field to do restoration is fairly new for us. And so we are working with organizations that are working in the Indian River Lagoon to do rehabilitate clams, not rehabilitate them, create clam beds and oyster beds, and then do those seagrass plantings. And so we right now are coordinating with other organizations, and we expect that program will grow, and then eventually we'll have Save the Manatee Club events that are assisting those organizations as well. So we've just been really excited about the number of people who are interested in helping with those projects, and so we're just trying to find additional ways to help out there. Corey, if you're hopping over to the chat, I think.
Yeah.
Are there more here? Okay.
There's lots of questions in the chat. I just hopped over to the chat, so I'm going to address some of those first before I hop back to the Q&A. So we have a question from Anne. If you could wave a magic money wand, how much funding would be needed to fix all the springs that are top manatee habitats?
Wow. Well, you know, there's a number of things that need to happen. So it would be in the order of billions. I've heard 13 billion for certain basin management action plans that have been put in place in Florida for springs. It is going to need to involve infrastructure improvements like taking septic tanks offline and connecting those to sewer systems, increasing the effectiveness of sewer wastewater treatment facilities. It's going to take public education and maybe some severe changes to the way that we apply fertilizer on our lawns. So it is a very infrastructure heavy and education heavy endeavor in the billions.
Yes, I second that. Okay, yeah, I think we have a little bit of an easier question from Eric. Why do manatees migrate away from Florida in the warmer months?
Well, and Cora, you have done more of this research than I have, but I would say that a lot of times these spring systems, even though they do have SAV within the spring run, oftentimes they're very sandy soil, so they don't have a lot of vegetation available in the spring themselves, which is where that warm water is. So they have to leave to eat essentially. So they'll go out and forage throughout the summertime because those springs. When they're there, and Cora has a photo behind her, they are very kind of congregating together. So there's just not a lot of vegetation there for them to maintain their weight.
Yeah, so manatees basically go where the food is. You know, once it warms up, they're not dependent on these warm water sources anymore, whether that's spring or power plants or wherever they're wintering. So they're basically just going where the food is. And, you know, in the winter time, they're really bound by these warm water sources. So they sort of congregate there, like Kim said, and the food sources right around these springs are, you know, getting depleted just because they're not migrating further away. So once it gets warm, you know, they like to travel, they like to migrate. The males usually look for females to mate with. So, I mean, they're traveling. Not all manatees are migrating outside of Florida. You know, some stay in Florida, but they're just more on the move to because they just have the ability to look for more vegetation than just the little that's around those warm water sites. All right, we have a question. Are they still endangered, and is the population increasing?
Manatees are not considered endangered. They have been downlisted to threatened. There was an uptick in manatee population counts. For what that's worth, it's difficult to count manatees in the water. The way that they do it is by planes. So, you know, they go below, they come up. That's a difficult endeavor. I think there was a second part of that question. Oh, the unusual mortality event that we're experiencing has resulted in the deaths of 1,600 manatees. So that's almost 20% of the population. And on the East Coast could represent, you know, it represents a significant number. We also don't know the long-term effects of that unusual mortality event. So we know that we're seeing a lot of orphaned calves, the fecund. We don't know about the reproductive success into the future of some of these animals that are experiencing these starvation type symptoms. So I think it's going to be a long time before we know what the true impacts of this unusual mortality event are.
Yeah, and the population surveys that were done, the last one was done in 2019, and there was about 6,000 manatees, you know, give or take. I mean, that's a minimum count. So the population has definitely been going up until then. But it's also really important to remember that manatees were actually never listed as endangered because of low numbers, but because of the threats that they were facing. And if you're looking at the threats, they have really gone up over time. So we need to keep a very close eye on that. In terms of whether the population is increasing or not. It's easier to say about local local populations. For example, the one at Blue Spring is doing really well. Upper St. Johns River, they're really growing, but that only represents a very small fraction of the statewide population. So like Kim said, you know, we lost all these manatees along the Atlantic coast, and then it's the question, what does that do to their reproduction? And so if that population is declining majorly, you know, another one is growing, you know, it's sort of, it's hard to really estimate whether the whole population as a whole is going up or down. Another question from Anne here. What is working to prevent boat strikes? Can education be required as part of getting or renewing a license? Force people to watch a healthy manatee and an injured one?
Yeah, I will say that the number of boat strikes is increasing, and we are, despite you know, a lot of manatee protection areas and slow zones. I think that what people would say is that enforcing those slow manatee zones would be, those manatee protection zones would be the way to decrease boat strikes. But again, we have more people on the water, and we have, you know, arguably more manatees in the water. We just ask people to go slow in those protection areas, wear polarized glasses when you're on the water, and then have a lookout. So make sure that you're paying attention to where manatees might be. Florida has been very reluctant to do put any sort of restrictions on boaters. It's kind of this idea that it's the last frontier of Florida and everybody has a right to enjoy the waterways. So that's been a struggle for us. There is a section in the boater safety courses that people who were born, I think people who were born after 1984 do have to take a boater safety course, but that doesn't prevent them from necessarily renting a boat on the weekends or things like that. So it is a challenge in Florida because of the lack of political will to really restrict or put any more requirements on boaters.
Yeah, we got an interesting question from Deb. So this is actually relating to spring, so I definitely want to make sure we address it. Has there been any research regarding potential impacts of climate change on Florida springs?
Yeah, I mean, that is something that the water management districts are looking closely at. You know, these increased weather events, reduced flows because of, well, there is a multi-decadal type of pattern with rain events, but we knew that we were just kind of coming out of a drought. So I do know that the water management districts are looking at that. I don't know what they're finding. I think what they're doing is trying to look into the future to plan better. Those minimum flows and levels, to my knowledge, do not include potential impacts of climate change. Most of them were done a few years back. They may be looking at that now. It's something we can ask about. Cora, this one's for you. International Manatee Awareness Day.
Yes, I'm going to take this one real quick. So somebody has a question about when is International Manatee Day, Manatee Awareness Day, all these kind of things. So there is a day dedicated called International Manatee Day, and that's in September. I believe it's September 7th. It's like right around the Labor Day week. So that's International Manatee Day. We also have Manatee Appreciation Day, which that's always the last Wednesday in March, so whatever day that falls on. And then we have Manatee Awareness Month, which is the entire month of November. So lots of awareness days, lots of awareness months for the manatee. All right, we have a lot of questions in the chat and I think in the Q&A box. So I'm trying to sort of get some of them in order that they came in.
We can answer while you're doing that, switching over. I can answer the one about local indigenous tribes interacting with manatees historically. I know that there have been photographs with indigenous tribes and manatees, so they did hunt them. To what extent, we don't know, that I'm not aware of. There may be research out there that deals with that more, but I do know that they were used as a food source. And until like the early, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the time. Florida did pass some regulations early on in its infancy to stop people from overhunting manatees. But it wasn't very well enforced. So I know that hunting manatees went into probably the 1940s. People were hunting manatees, and I don't know what the impact of that, or whether those were simply or typically indigenous peoples, or other Floridians that were doing that.
right, the next question would be from Scott. What can be done to restore the Indian River Lagoon? I know it would be very expensive since there's so many pollution sources there. I think a lot of people had questions about, you know, replanting seagrasses, restoring the lagoon. So maybe we can sort of address that in a bundled question. It's a difficult question.
Yeah, there have been estimates. In fact, the Indian River Lagoon National Estuary Program did do an analysis of what it was going to cost to restore the Indian River Lagoon if they put in all the projects that were proposed for the Indian River Lagoon in the Basin Management Action Plan that goes along with the total maximum daily load restrictions for the area. So that's a long way to say the communities in the area have planned a number of projects, and the Indian River Lagoon National Estuary Program put a number on that at $5 billion to implement the projects that have been identified. But so yeah, as a starting place, 5 billion is the number.
And there are many different projects that are being implemented that are in place right now, but it's very difficult to regrow seagrasses in a polluted system. So it's really about cleaning up the system first before you can replant seagrasses. And we know that a lot of locals want to get involved. You know, can I replant seagrasses in my canal because I'm not seeing seagrass there anymore? We were just at a symposium last week where we addressed that question. And it's really important to partner with organizations that are currently growing seagrasses, for example, in nurseries, and then they're doing these outplanting efforts, because regrowing seagrasses, it's a very difficult undertaking to begin with. So there's different trials and different projects going on right now. We have a website, savethemanatee.org/algae, where we can find more information about what projects are being done, how are they being implemented, and what are the volunteer opportunities to participate in those. That's probably the quick summary for this question. Okay, here we have, what are your organization's efforts for the Weeki Wachee River?
Weeki Wachee. So we are aware that this is a hotspot for manatee and human interactions. Cora and our previous education manager went out a couple of years ago and documented some of that. We've helped to place some signs at Rogers Park. We are working to place another sign at Hospital Hole. We are hoping to do some outreach to the people who are renting out their homes through VRBO. So we're developing that now and anticipate getting that out in the next few months. But we also have a few guardian guides, people there, operators there. So people who have signed up for our program for being responsible ecotourism operators. So we're trying to work with them to get the word out as well. It's interesting because Weeki Wachee there's a lot of private ownership there. So we're working with the Water Management District to see if we can get some additional signage, and we're open to suggestions. So if you have contacts for us, people that we need to be talking to, please let us know.
All right, I'm jumping back to the Q&A. I just have two questions in here. One I can address fairly quickly. What's the difference between a manatee and a dugong, and can they live together? So the dugong is a cousin species of the manatee. They both belong to the order of Sirenia, but the dugong lives in Australia and the Indo-Pacific, versus the manatee, which lives, there's three different species of manatees. One lives around West Africa, it's West African manatee, the West Indian manatee that we talked about today, which lives around Florida and the wider Caribbean, and then the Amazonian manatee down in South America. So question, could they live together? Yes, potentially, but their habitats just don't overlap. And then we have a question from Valerie. You mentioned fertilizer contributing to nutrient pollution. Is there any regulation of agriculture activity specifically that currently combats nutrient pollution? Are there any changes in agriculture industry norms and technology combating nutrient pollution?
I would say that on paper, yes, there are regulations. The implementation of those regulations has been lacking, just to be very honest, at the state level. So the Department of Agricultural and Consumer Services is responsible for making sure that agricultural producers are enrolled in best management practices and that they're implementing them. A lack of funding and staffing made it difficult and almost impossible for DACs to implement that program effectively. There are also some concerns about they really don't look at farms that are less than 50 acres, according to some of the staff folks. So in the Springs area, that is a major contributor to nutrient pollution, and and it is also an area that needs additional attention. So it's one of the failings of a parent, I mean, just to be very honest, a failing system to deal with that. Now, I don't want to put all of this on the backs of producers. There just sometimes is a lack of knowledge that they have this requirement. So again, that's on the state to make sure that those folks know what they're supposed to be doing and implement that properly. Oh, you're muted, Cora.
Sorry, just realized that there was a lot of noise going on in the background, so I decided to best. Next question is from Tyler. Any ideas on how we get more cities located on the ICW Intercoastal Waterway on the east coast of Florida to plant more of the eelgrass mats?
Yeah, and I'll just go back to what you said earlier, Cora, about that not every area in the Indian River Lagoon or in the Intercoastal Waterway is a good habitat for seagrass now. The water quality is not good. The substrate is mucky and wouldn't maybe be able to be adhere. You know, the roots wouldn't be able to adhere there. So if they're being very careful about where these seagrass mats are going. And I think that people who want to get involved in the Intercoastal Waterway with seagrass planting should probably contact the Florida Oceanographic Society, Brevard Zoo, the Marine Resources Council, and others who are maybe working in their area.
Yes, good answer. The next question, have you all considered partnering with gardening organizations to establish certifications for manatee and spring healthy gardening, wildlife-friendly gardening, science for houses, so neighbors can educate each other?
Yeah, that is thank you for bringing that up. We are in the process. We did a fertilizer campaign last year, and we're in the process of expanding that. People were interested in doing this, having these signs. So we're putting together a pledge and the opportunity to get those signs. It's basically going to ask you to skip fertilizing this summer. And so you'll be able to use that hopefully to start a dialogue with your neighbors to get less fertilizer out there. Big fan of Florida friendly gardening.
Yes, so stay tuned for that. We are working on it. I can probably take this one from Robert. Has the organization considered setting up an ability to name a manatee for significant larger donations? There have been some organizations or donors who have named manatees. That's something that we would have to address with our development department. So any questions about that, if you could email them to us and we will pass them over to our development team. Well, Kim, let's see if you want to do this on me. How much of a difference is there in vegetation in the springs, ocean, and rivers that manatees eat?
Oh, well, there's a good bit of difference. In the springs, you know, typically you're going to find eelgrass in springs type systems. Usually plants that grow in freshwater aren't the same ones that will grow in saltwater. And so just like on land where you have different water quality, water types, you're going to get different temperatures, you're going to get different types of plants. So for example, in Northeast Florida, manatees are kind of known to occasionally eat spartina. We don't have spartina grass down here. They're gonna get in the coastal areas. Usually they'll have, oh my gosh, what's the name of that seagrass? Well, we call that, just in general, we call that seagrass, and we call freshwater similar looking stuff eelgrass. So oh, you're on mute again.
Oh, I wasn't saying anything. I was just looking. No, I think it's really important to keep in mind that manatees don't just eat submerged vegetation, they also eat floating vegetation. So you may see them eating like water hyacinth, pennyworth, alligator weed, all these kind of things that are floating on the surface of the water. And that can, vary from region to region. You might find different kinds of vegetation in rivers like the St. John's River compared to what you would find along the coast.
Yeah.
All right, so we have about 5 more minutes. I'm trying to get at least to some of these questions that we have here. Bill, sorry, are there any opportunities to work in research with manatees and springs?
Yeah, there are a number. I mean, most of the universities in Florida have some sort of water quality type program, but there is, I think I have well, I have the Blue Water Audit, which is actually associated with the Florida Springs Institute. They have classes and different types of activities that you can do through them. So that would be a good place maybe to start, is look up the Florida Springs Institute and maybe take one of their mini classes. But really any higher learning college or university would have a program where you can study one or both of those things.
All right. Bill just has a comment: in my backyard, manatees eat ferns along the banks. Are their ferns considered a legit food source? So I mean, I think Kim pretty much addressed that by saying there's different food sources in different areas. So manatees can definitely be seen, you know, eating ferns or any like floating vegetation or shoreline vegetation like spadina grass or those kind of things as well. So yes. Let's see.
While you're doing that, I'll add a little bit to that. So if people have been concerned about, you know, whether or not the romaine lettuce that was provided to manatees this past winter was a legit food source, if you will, or if it was nutritionally consistent with what they typically had. And I will say that based on what we're hearing from Fish and Wildlife Commission, and we know this for a fact, that they consulted with a number of veterinarians to come up with that romaine lettuce as the food source. So there were people who were concerned, you know, that it wasn't going to be nutritious enough, but veterinarians have weighed in and said that it was. So that's why they chose that. Impacts of jet skis.
Yeah, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes back to the mortality of boat strikes. So I think that those all get lumped in. If there's a, I don't know if there have been individual studies of jet skis, but that would probably go into that broader category of boat strikes.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is important to realize that it's not just propellers that injure or kill manatees. If you're looking at the statistics, it's actually about 60% of manatee mortality from watercraft is caused by the impact of the hull. So, you know, why having a propeller guard is a good step it's a good first step in the right direction to protect manatees. It's really important to go slow in manatee habitat, and those impact strikes can really happen from anything, starting with a jet ski to a very large power boat. So jet skis have definitely caused manatee injuries or potentially deaths as well. So when we're talking about boat strikes, we're not just talking about propellers or big power boats, we're including all these personal watercraft in there as well. All right, let's see. Is the manatee the state marine mammal? Yes, it is. That was an easy question. I think I had one in the Q&A here about microplastic ingestion. You're discovering ingestion of microplastics killing manatees as and other marine mammals. So most manatees that die in Florida have some sort of foreign objects in their guts, whether that killed them directly or whether that's just something they had ingested. Yes, absolutely. Whether that's microplastics or larger plastics, I think it's really both. Fishing gear ingestion is a really big issue. We just recently had a manatee pass away from ingesting monofilament line. So all these kind of things are definitely something that manatees are affected by as well. Whether it directly kills them or whether it's just something they eat and, you know, shouldn't be eating. All right, so I think that's everything from the Q&A. Let's see if we have any more in the. Okay, we have here one from Scott. This may be a good one for Kim. Florida just passed a bill making it easier for farmers to use more fertilizer if they get an expert to say it's required, I believe. Moving backwards on that issue.
Yes, absolutely. That bill was limited to just citrus, but it did authorize and basically direct the Institute of Food and Agricultural Services or Sciences and DAX. I can't remember which of those organizations was named, but basically saying this year it's for citrus and we want you to look at opening this up to other commodities. So yes, a step in the wrong direction. For manatees anyway.
For manatees, yes. So I think this question, it's a good one to address by Catherine. What about the amount of waste that manatees produce? I think I think the public uses that as a measure of nutrient load on the IRL and some commissioners. Kim, do you want to? So you're muted.
Yeah, I mean, we can probably both tackle this. Obviously, manatees have been co-evolving with seagrasses over millennia, and they are not creating the nutrient load that is impacting seagrasses to the extent that we're losing them in the Indian River Lagoon. So a seagrass meadow can produce, tons. These are some of the most prolific producing ecosystems on Earth. So the manatees are not creating the nutrient load that's killing the seagrasses. This is the bottom line.
Yeah, if it was a healthy ecosystem, I mean, manatees have evolved with these seagrasses over millions of years. So in a healthy system, they would really just crop the grasses and then move on from one pasture to the next, almost like a cow on land would do. And they would fertilize them in the process. So it's really not the manatees' waste that's killing the seagrasses or causing that nutrient pollution. It's an argument that a lot of people will make as a sort of an easy way out. But it is certainly not the root cause of that problem. All right, Kim, we have just time for 2 more questions. Sure. I have here from Eric. I think I kind of addressed this before. Why are propeller guards not required on boats?
Yeah, like Cora said, the impact of the boats to the manatees, oftentimes splitting their ribs, which impacts their lungs. Those are the things that kill manatees as much as any of the wounds that they sustain from those props. So again, the best thing to do is go slow in manatee areas. And
propeller guards are commercially available, so people can actually purchase them. They're not mandatory. That's only something can be made mandatory by the Coast Guard. I personally think it's definitely a good step in the right direction if used responsibly. It's very dangerous for people to buy them and think the problem is solved and they can go as fast as they want because now they have a propeller guard and ignoring anything else. I think we're going to wrap it up with the last question here. Maybe both of us can answer that. What gives you hope? What are you most excited about in the future for manatees?
Do you want to go first, Cora?
Sure, because actually somebody asked me that this morning during the interview. So let's see if I can get that together. Well, basically, what I'm thinking. I mean, manatees have lived and co-evolved for such a long time. They're very adaptable. They're extremely, extremely resilient, which, can really give us, it's sort of a wake-up call. If we have a little bit of a headache, we run to get an aspirin or Tylenol or something. If we have a little paper cut, we need a Band-Aid right away. And these animals suffer these incredibly, painful boat strikes and entanglements, and they can live with them and heal from them, which they're just an incredibly resilient animal. And at the same time, what they're suffering from right now is almost all human caused. So my hope is that because we caused it, we are the ones who can fix it. But we really all need to work together and all really get our act together as individuals, as well as organizations or elected representatives. And I think if we all work together, we can make it happen. But we really need to do it now and not think, my voice or my actions don't matter. I'm just going to sit back and hope for the worst or whatever. I mean, it's really, there's a lot of things that every individual can literally do. And if we do that, I think then, there can be a future for manatees.
For me, I got really excited when we, had the report of Gemini Springs, the people seeing manatees in Gemini Springs, and just recognizing that sometimes these projects that our water management districts are doing or these agencies are doing actually have these great consequences for manatees. I know it was just 1 or 2 manatees this time, but my hope is that we'll kind of wake up and see that we can provide access for manatees to places where they should be, like these springs that are currently where their access is prohibited. My hope is that we remove Rodman Dam and that they can have free range toward those places that they normally had. And interestingly, I think that both folks who are pro restoration for manatees and people who might think that manatees shouldn't be relying on power plants as much have this in common. We know that this issue of warm water habitat needs to be addressed. And I think that if we can get behind that, provide more habitat for manatees, there definitely is hope. And in doing that, we'll restore restore systems that have been inhibited by these dams. So that's what I'm hopeful for. I'm also encouraged by the numbers of manatees that were at Blue Spring this year. that had maybe been in Brevard area last year. So that kind of shows me that they can relearn, or they can adapt. So like Cora said, they recover from these horrendous injuries. And so while they have a lot of site fidelity, they are adaptable. So they've been here a long time. Hopefully we don't do them in.